Sarah Martinez had always been the smallest person in every room she entered, but her determination was bigger than most people's entire bodies. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone who could survive the brutal Marine Corps training. Yet here she was, standing in formation at Camp Pendleton on a freezing December morning, preparing for what would become the most challenging experience of her life. The Winter Conditioning March was legendary among Marines. 25 miles through mountainous terrain in sub-freezing temperatures, carrying a full pack weighing 60 pounds. It wasn't officially required, but everyone knew that completing it meant something special. It separated the truly committed from those who were just getting by. Sarah had volunteered immediately when the opportunity was announced, despite the warnings from her drill instructors. "Martinez, you sure about this?" Drill Sergeant Johnson had asked when she signed up. "This isn't some weekend camping trip. We've had grown men twice your size drop out within the first 5 miles. Sarah had looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, sir. I'm sure." That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, she had trained harder than ever before, running extra miles in the early morning darkness, doing additional strength training, and studying maps of the route they would take through the San Bernardino Mountains. She knew she would need every advantage she could get. The other Marines in her unit had mixed reactions to her participation. Some respected her courage, while others whispered that she was just trying to show off. A few made jokes about how they'd probably have to carry her pack before the march was over. Sarah heard every comment but never responded. She let her training do the talking. Her best friend in the unit, Corporal David Kim, had tried to talk her out of it. "Sarah, I've done this march twice, and it nearly killed me both times. The cold up there is unlike anything you've experienced. Frostbite is a real possibility, and hypothermia has sent people to the hospital." "I appreciate your concern, David, but I need to do this," Sarah had replied. "I didn't join the Marines to take the easy path." David understood. He had grown up poor in Los Angeles and knew what it meant to have something to prove. Sarah had shared her story with him during their friendship. She came from a military family where her father and 2 older brothers had all been Marines. Her father, Colonel Martinez, was a decorated veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Her brothers, Miguel and Carlos, were both staff sergeants who had earned numerous commendations for their service. When Sarah announced she wanted to join the Marines, her family's reaction was complicated. They were proud, but worried. Her father had pulled her aside for a long conversation about the challenges she would face as a woman in the military. "Mija, you're going to have to work twice as hard to prove yourself," he had said. "There will be people who doubt you every step of the way. You'll need to be stronger, faster, and tougher than everyone expects." Her mother, Elena, had been more direct in her concerns. "Sarah, you're so small. How will you keep up with men who are twice your size?" But Sarah had made up her mind. She wanted to serve her country, and she wanted to prove that size didn't determine strength. The Winter March represented everything she had been working toward since she enlisted. The morning of the march arrived with temperatures dropping to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the ground with a thin layer that crunched under their boots. Sarah stood in formation with 47 other Marines, all checking their gear one final time. She had prepared meticulously. Her pack contained everything required: sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, emergency shelter, medical kit, rations for 3 days, water purification tablets, extra clothing, and survival equipment. Every item had been weighed and positioned carefully to distribute the load evenly across her small frame. Her gloves were military-issued winter gloves, thick and insulated, designed to protect hands in extreme cold. She had bought an additional pair of liner gloves to wear underneath for extra warmth, knowing that her hands would be vulnerable due to her smaller body mass and reduced circulation in the cold. As they formed up, Sarah noticed Staff Sergeant Reynolds watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Reynolds was known for being particularly tough on female Marines, believing that the military was no place for women in combat roles. He had made his opinion clear on several occasions, though never directly to Sarah's face. "Listen up, Marines!" shouted Captain Williams, the officer in charge of the march. "This is not a competition. This is about mental toughness, physical endurance, and your ability to complete a mission under adverse conditions. The route will take us through Angeles National Forest, up to an elevation of 8,000 feet. Weather conditions will deteriorate as we climb. Stick together, watch out for your fellow Marines, and remember your training." The group began moving at 600 hours, stepping off into the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah had positioned herself in the middle of the formation, knowing that the front would set a pace that might be too aggressive for the long haul, while the back would likely struggle with the slowest marchers. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. The pace was steady but manageable, and Sarah felt confident in her preparation. Her pack sat comfortably, and her boots gripped the trail well despite the snow. The conversation around her was minimal, as everyone focused on settling into their rhythm. As the sun began to rise, the mountain landscape revealed itself in stunning detail. Snow-covered peaks stretched in every direction, and the air was so clear that Sarah could see for miles. Under different circumstances, she would have found it beautiful. Today, it represented a challenge that would test everything she had learned in her military training. By the third hour, they had gained significant elevation, and the temperature continued to drop. Sarah could see her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and she felt the cold beginning to penetrate her layers despite her careful preparation. Her feet were starting to feel the chill, and she made a mental note to pay attention to any signs of numbness that might indicate frostbite. It was during the first rest break that Staff Sergeant Reynolds approached her. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made her immediately alert. "Let me see your gear." This wasn't unusual. Drill instructors regularly inspected equipment during training exercises. Sarah opened her pack and laid out her contents for inspection. Reynolds examined each item carefully, checking weights and specifications. "These gloves," he said, picking up her military-issued winter gloves. "Where did you get the liner gloves?" "I purchased them myself, Staff Sergeant. They meet all specifications and are approved for use." Reynolds held both pairs of gloves, examining them closely. "According to regulations, you're only authorized to carry the equipment that was issued to you. Personal modifications to standard gear can compromise the integrity of the exercise." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Staff Sergeant, the liner gloves are within regulations. They're designed to be used with the issued gloves for additional warmth." "Not on my watch, Martinez. You'll complete this march with standard issue equipment only. Hand them over." Other Marines had stopped to watch the exchange. Sarah knew that arguing would only make things worse, but she also knew that losing her gloves in these temperatures could be dangerous. Her hands were already her most vulnerable point due to her size and circulation issues. "Staff Sergeant, with respect, removing my gloves could put me at risk for frostbite. The temperature is expected to drop even lower as we gain elevation." Reynolds stepped closer. "Are you questioning my authority, Marine?" Sarah knew she was at a crossroads. She could continue to argue and risk being removed from the march entirely, or she could comply and trust in her training to get her through. Around her, the other Marines watched silently, waiting to see how she would respond. "No, Staff Sergeant," she said finally, handing over both pairs of gloves. Reynolds pocketed the gloves and walked away without another word. Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling the cold air against her now bare hands. She had backup gloves in her pack, but they were much thinner and designed for warmer weather. Corporal Kim approached her quietly. "Sarah, you can't do this march without proper gloves." "Let me talk to Reynolds." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I'll figure it out." She pulled the backup gloves from her pack and put them on. They were better than nothing, but she could already feel the difference. The material was thinner, and they weren't designed for prolonged exposure to sub-freezing temperatures. As the march resumed, Sarah found herself thinking about her father's words about working twice as hard to prove herself. This was exactly what he had been talking about. Reynolds wasn't testing her equipment, he was testing her resolve. He wanted to see if she would quit when things got difficult. The trail became steeper as they climbed higher into the mountains. Sarah's pack seemed to get heavier with each step, and the cold was becoming more intense. Her hands were already feeling numb despite the thin gloves, and she knew it was going to get worse before it got better. She began employing techniques she had learned in survival training. Every few minutes, she would make fists and pump her arms to encourage blood flow to her hands. When possible, she would tuck her hands under her armpits for warmth. She started eating small amounts of high-calorie food regularly to keep her body generating heat. By noon, they had covered 10 miles and reached an elevation of 6,000 feet. The temperature had dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind had picked up, creating a wind chill that made the air feel even colder. During the lunch break, several Marines complained about the conditions, and 2 had already shown signs of mild hypothermia. Sarah's hands were now completely numb. She couldn't feel her fingers when she tried to operate the zippers on her pack, and she had to use her teeth to open her water bottle. The other Marines were beginning to notice her struggle, but she tried to hide the extent of the problem. "Martinez, you doing okay?" asked Private Johnson, a large Marine from Texas who had been friendly to her throughout training. "I'm fine," Sarah lied, not wanting word to get back to Reynolds that she was having trouble. But she wasn't fine. The numbness in her hands was spreading up her fingers, and she was having trouble gripping her equipment. She knew she was in the early stages of frostbite, but she also knew that admitting it would mean being pulled from the march. As they prepared to move out for the afternoon portion of the march, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her experience. Instead of asking for help or admitting her condition, she decided to adapt. She began using her pack straps and equipment in creative ways that didn't require fine motor control with her fingers. She tied her water bottle to her belt with a cord so she wouldn't drop it. She used her whole hand to grip items instead of trying to use individual fingers. When she needed to manipulate equipment, she would warm her hands against her body for a few seconds first. The afternoon brought even greater challenges. The trail became more treacherous, with icy patches and steep switchbacks that tested everyone's endurance. Several Marines had already dropped out, unable to continue in the extreme conditions. Each time someone quit, Sarah noticed Reynolds looking in her direction, as if expecting her to be next. By 1500 hours, they had covered 15 miles and reached 7,000 feet elevation. The temperature was now below zero, and the wind was creating whiteout conditions that made navigation difficult. Sarah's hands had progressed beyond numbness to a burning sensation that she knew was dangerous. During another rest break, David pulled her aside. "Sarah, I can see your hands. They're white. And you can't grip anything properly. This isn't worth permanent damage." Sarah looked at her hands. David was right. They were pale and waxy-looking, classic signs of frostbite. But she also saw something else in his eyes. Respect for what she was attempting to do. "I know the risks, David. But I also know that if I quit now, it'll follow me for the rest of my career." "Reynolds will make sure of that." David nodded slowly. "Then let me help you without making it obvious. I'll stay close and help with anything that requires fine motor skills." Sarah smiled for the first time since the morning. "Thank you." As the march continued into the late afternoon, word had quietly spread among the other Marines about what Reynolds had done and how Sarah was handling it. Without making it obvious, several Marines began helping her in small ways. Someone would open a difficult zipper on her pack. Another would hand her items she couldn't grip properly. Private Johnson started walking near her to provide a windbreak. Sarah realized that something significant was happening. Instead of seeing her as a liability or someone who didn't belong, her fellow Marines were beginning to see her as someone worth supporting. Her quiet determination in the face of an unfair challenge was earning their respect. But the physical challenges were becoming increasingly severe. As evening approached and temperatures continued to drop, Sarah knew she was fighting not just for the completion of the march, but for the use of her hands for the rest of her life. The burning sensation had given way to a deep, throbbing pain that she knew meant the frostbite was progressing. She thought about her family, about all the conversations with her father about proving herself. She thought about every person who had ever said she was too small, too weak, or didn't belong in the military. Each painful step forward was a response to every doubt that had ever been expressed about her capabilities. The sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. They still had 10 miles to go, and the temperature was expected to drop even further during the night. Sarah knew the hardest part of the march was still ahead of her. As darkness fell and the Marines switched on their headlamps, Sarah continued to put one foot in front of the other, her hands burning with cold, but her determination burning even brighter. She had come too far to quit now, and she was beginning to understand that this march was about much more than just completing a physical challenge. It was about proving to herself, and to everyone else, that courage came in all sizes, and that the strength to continue came from something deeper than physical capability. The real test wasn't her body's ability to withstand the cold, but her spirit's ability to overcome any obstacle placed in her path. The night was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez was ready for whatever it would bring. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero as the Marines entered the most dangerous phase of their march. Night in the mountains brought challenges that daylight training could never fully prepare them for. The wind howled through the peaks, creating a constant noise that made communication difficult and sapped energy from every exposed surface of their bodies. Sarah's headlamp cut through the darkness, creating a small circle of visibility in the swirling snow. Behind that light, her world had become very small. Each step required conscious effort, and her hands had progressed beyond pain into a numbness so complete that she could no longer tell if she was gripping her equipment properly. 23 Marines remained from the original group of 48. The others had been evacuated for various cold-related injuries or simple exhaustion. Each evacuation had been announced over the radio, and Sarah noticed that Reynolds looked in her direction every time, waiting for her name to be called. "Martinez, how are you holding up?" Captain Williams had appeared beside her during a brief water break. Sarah knew this was a critical moment. Williams was genuinely concerned for her welfare, but she also suspected that Reynolds had asked him to check on her specifically. Any sign of weakness would give Reynolds the excuse he needed to pull her from the march. "Doing fine, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the chattering of her teeth. Williams studied her face in the light of his headlamp. Even in the darkness, he could see that her lips had a bluish tint that indicated the early stages of hypothermia. "Let me see your hands, Marine." Sarah hesitated. Showing her hands would reveal the extent of her frostbite, but refusing a direct order from a captain would be worse. She slowly pulled off her thin gloves. Williams shone his light on her hands and immediately understood the severity of the situation. Her fingers were waxy white, and when he touched them lightly, she didn't react at all. These were hands that might require medical amputation if the condition worsened. "Martinez, you need to be evacuated. This level of frostbite requires immediate medical attention." "Sir, with respect, I can continue. I've been managing the condition, and I understand the risks." Williams looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. In his 10 years as a Marine officer, he had seen many displays of courage, but what Sarah was attempting bordered on the impossible. She was risking permanent disability for the sake of proving a point. The march has another 12 hours, Martinez. The temperature is going to drop even further. You could lose your fingers. Sarah met his gaze directly. Sir, I joined the Marines to serve my country and to prove that I belong here. If I quit now because of something Staff Sergeant Reynolds did, it'll follow me for my entire career. I'd rather risk my fingers than live with that. Williams understood. He had dealt with Reynolds before and knew about his prejudices against female Marines. He also knew that pulling Sarah from the march now, after she had come so far, would be exactly what Reynolds wanted. If you continue, you'll need constant monitoring. I'm assigning Corporal Kim to stay with you. At the first sign that your condition is becoming life-threatening, you're out. Understood? Yes, sir. As Williams walked away, David appeared at Sarah's side. He had overheard the conversation and understood his new responsibility. Sarah, I'm going to help you get through this, but you have to promise me that if I say you need medical help, you'll listen. I promise. David had brought something with him, a pair of chemical hand warmers that he had been saving for his own use. Put these inside your gloves, they'll give you maybe 2 hours of warmth. Sarah wanted to refuse the gift, knowing that David would suffer without them, but she also knew she needed every advantage she could get. Thank you. The hand warmers provided immediate relief. For the first time in hours, Sarah could feel her fingers again. The sensation was painful as circulation returned, but it was also hopeful. She began moving her fingers inside the gloves, trying to restore mobility while the warmers were effective. The trail continued to climb, and the wind became increasingly fierce. The Marines were now moving in single file, each following the headlamp of the person in front of them. Visibility was so poor that straying even a few feet from the trail could mean becoming lost in a whiteout that could be fatal. Sarah found herself thinking about her childhood in San Diego, where winter meant temperatures in the 60s, and her biggest concern was whether to wear shorts or long pants to school. The contrast with her current situation was so extreme that it seemed like a different lifetime. She remembered the day she told her father she wanted to join the Marines. They had been sitting on their back patio, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. Her father had just returned from his deployment in Afghanistan, and she had been asking him about his experiences. Mija, being a Marine isn't just about being tough, he had said. It's about refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. It's about standing up when everyone expects you to fall down. Those words echoed in her mind as she struggled through the snow. This was exactly the situation her father had been preparing her for, though she doubted he had imagined it would be this literal. Around midnight, they reached the highest point of the march at 8,000 feet elevation. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and the wind was creating a wind chill that made the air feel like 30 below. At this point, exposed skin would freeze within minutes. During the brief rest at the summit, Sarah realized that the hand warmers were beginning to lose their effectiveness. She could feel the numbness creeping back into her fingers, and she knew she didn't have any more reserves to draw upon. Private Johnson approached her with something wrapped in his jacket. Martinez, I want you to have this. He unwrapped a small thermos of hot coffee that he had been carrying. I can't take your coffee, Sarah protested. You're not taking it, Johnson replied with a smile. I'm giving it to you. There's a difference. The hot coffee was like liquid life flowing through her system. Sarah felt warmth spreading from her core outward, and for a brief moment, her shivering subsided. But more important than the physical warmth was the message it sent. Johnson was a Marine from a traditional military family who had initially been skeptical of women in combat roles. His gesture meant that she had earned his respect. As they prepared to descend from the summit, Staff Sergeant Reynolds appeared beside her again. Still think you can finish this march, Martinez? Yes, Staff Sergeant. Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. In the light of his headlamp, Sarah could see something in his expression that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just hostility. There was also a kind of challenge, as if he was testing her for reasons she didn't understand. "You know, Martinez, I had a sister who wanted to join the military. She was about your size, determined like you. I told her she wasn't cut out for it, that she should find something more suitable for women." Sarah wasn't sure why Reynolds was sharing this personal information, but she sensed it was important. "She joined the Air Force anyway," Reynolds continued. "Became a pilot, flew combat missions in Iraq. She proved me wrong." "What happened to her, Staff Sergeant?" "She died in a helicopter crash 3 years ago. Mechanical failure, nothing she could have prevented." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about her a lot lately, especially watching you prepare for this march." Sarah began to understand. Reynolds wasn't just testing her because he didn't think women belonged in the military. He was testing her because he didn't want to see another woman hurt by the dangers of military service. His hostility was rooted in protectiveness, not prejudice. "Staff Sergeant, I'm sorry about your sister." "Don't be sorry, Martinez. Just don't quit. She would have respected what you're doing here." Reynolds walked away, leaving Sarah with a completely different understanding of their relationship. The removal of her gloves hadn't been about breaking her down. It had been about seeing if she was strong enough to survive when everything went wrong. The descent from the summit was treacherous. The trail was covered with ice, and several Marines slipped and fell. Sarah's hands were so numb that she couldn't feel her trekking poles. But she used them anyway, trusting in their placement even though she couldn't feel the feedback. David stayed close to her, ready to catch her if she fell. Other Marines had formed an informal support network around her, understanding that her success had become symbolic of something larger than individual achievement. Around 0300 hours, they reached the overnight bivouac site. The Marines were expected to set up individual shelters and spend 3 hours resting before completing the final leg of the march. For Sarah, this represented perhaps the greatest challenge yet. Setting up a shelter required fine motor skills that she no longer possessed. "I've got this," David said, immediately understanding her problem. But before he could start, 3 other Marines appeared and began helping without being asked. Private Johnson and 2 others quickly set up Sarah's shelter, while David helped her get into her sleeping bag. Once inside, Sarah tried to assess her condition honestly. Her hands were completely numb, and when she looked at them with a flashlight, she could see that the frostbite had progressed significantly. Her fingers were white and waxy, and she couldn't move them independently. She knew she was at the point where permanent damage was likely. Even if she completed the march, she might lose parts of her fingers. But she also knew that she had come too far to quit now. 8 miles remained, and she was determined to cover every one of them. David crawled into his shelter next to hers. "Sarah, I have to ask, are you sure about this? Your hands look really bad." "I know. But I also know that I'll regret quitting for the rest of my life. I can deal with damaged fingers, but I can't deal with not knowing if I could have finished." "I understand. But promise me that if you collapse, you'll let us get you medical help." "I promise." Sarah tried to sleep, but the pain in her hands made it impossible. Instead, she lay in her sleeping bag thinking about what the march had taught her so far. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was continuing despite fear. She had learned that strength came not just from muscles, but from the refusal to accept defeat. Most importantly, she had learned that earning respect wasn't about being perfect. It was about being authentic in the face of challenges that revealed who you really were. The 3 hours of rest passed quickly. At 0600 hours, the Marines began breaking camp for the final push to the finish line. Sarah's hands had not improved during the rest period, but she had managed to generate enough core body heat to prevent hypothermia. As she struggled to pack her gear, the same group of Marines who had helped her set up camp quietly appeared to help her break it down. No words were spoken, they simply understood what needed to be done. The final 8 miles would take them down the mountain and back to the trailhead where vehicles were waiting. The descent would be easier on her cardiovascular system, but harder on her feet and legs, and the cold would remain a constant threat. Staff Sergeant Reynolds appeared as they formed up for the final leg. He looked at Sarah directly. "Martinez, last chance to back out with honor. No one will think less of you." Sarah looked around at the Marines who had supported her through the night. She saw respect in their eyes, but she also saw concern. They wanted her to succeed, but not at the cost of permanent injury. "Staff Sergeant, I'm going to finish what I started." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Then let's see what you're made of, Marine." As the group began moving down the mountain in the early morning darkness, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced before during the entire march. Confidence. Not confidence that it would be easy, but confidence that she would find a way to complete it. She had already survived the worst night of her life. She had already proven that she wouldn't quit when things became difficult. The remaining 8 miles were just a matter of putting one foot in front of the other until she reached the end. But as the sun began to rise over the mountains and the final phase of the march began, Sarah had no idea that the greatest challenges still lay ahead of her. The morning sun painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold, creating a beautiful scene that stood in sharp contrast to the suffering of the Marines making their way down the treacherous trail. Sarah's world had narrowed to the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other, each step a small victory against the pain that shot through her frozen hands. 20 Marines remained from the original group. The overnight bivouac had claimed 3 more due to hypothermia, leaving a core group of the most determined and physically capable. Sarah knew she was probably the least physically capable of those remaining, but she also knew that none of the others had overcome what she had overcome to get this far. The trail was different in daylight. What had been a mysterious path through darkness was now revealed as a narrow track carved into the side of steep mountain slopes. In some places, the trail was only 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet on one side. The ice and snow made every step dangerous. 2 miles into the final leg, Sarah stumbled and nearly fell off the trail. David, who had been shadowing her closely, caught her arm and pulled her back from the edge. As he did so, he felt how cold her arm was even through her jacket. "Sarah, you're hypothermic. Your core temperature is dropping." Sarah knew he was right. She could feel the sluggish thinking and confusion that accompanied hypothermia setting in. Her body was finally beginning to shut down after 18 hours of extreme cold exposure. "I just need to keep moving," she said, but her words were slurred slightly. David made a decision. He unzipped his own jacket and pulled out a chemical body warmer that he had been saving. Without asking permission, he unzipped Sarah's jacket and placed the warmer against her core. "David, I can't take that. You need it for yourself. I'm twice your size with twice your body mass. You need it more than I do." The warmth from the body warmer began to spread through Sarah's core, helping her thinking become clearer. She realized how close she had come to losing the ability to continue, and she understood the sacrifice that David was making for her. Around her, she could see that the other Marines were also suffering. Private Johnson was limping from what appeared to be a twisted ankle. Corporal Stevens had developed a persistent cough that suggested fluid in his lungs from the cold. Everyone was pushing themselves beyond their normal limits. But something had changed in the group dynamic since the overnight rest. The Marines were no longer just individual participants in a training exercise. They had become a unit working together to ensure that everyone who could finish would finish. Sarah had become a symbol of that collective determination. Staff Sergeant Reynolds appeared beside the group, checking on their progress. Sarah noticed that he looked as exhausted as everyone else, despite his experience and physical conditioning. "How much further?" "Staff Sergeant, asked Private Johnson. 6 miles to the finish line, Reynolds replied. The hardest 6 miles you'll ever walk. He looked directly at Sarah. Martinez, medical is standing by at mile marker 22. Last chance to get those hands looked at by a professional. Sarah looked at her hands inside the thin gloves. She couldn't feel them at all anymore, and when she tried to make a fist, nothing happened. She knew the frostbite had progressed to a dangerous level. What would happen if I got medical treatment now? She asked. They'd evacuate you immediately, probably to a hospital for emergency treatment of severe frostbite. Sarah considered this information carefully. She was 3 miles from medical care and 6 miles from the finish line. Getting treatment now might save her fingers, but it would also mean failing to complete what she had started. I'll continue to the finish line, she said. Reynolds studied her face for a long moment. Martinez, I need you to understand something. If you continue and your hands get worse, you could be looking at amputation. This isn't just about toughness anymore. This is about permanent disability. I understand, Staff Sergeant. Reynolds nodded and moved on to check the other Marines. Sarah noticed that he didn't try to argue with her decision further, and she wondered if that meant he respected her choice or if he thought she was making a terrible mistake. The trail continued to descend, and the temperature began to rise slightly as they lost elevation. Sarah felt hopeful that the worst of the cold exposure was behind them, but she also knew that her hands were beyond the point where warming would help immediately. At mile 22, they reached the medical checkpoint. A Navy corpsman was waiting with warming equipment and emergency medical supplies. He immediately approached Sarah. Marine, I need to examine your hands. Sarah reluctantly removed her gloves. The corpsman took one look and immediately reached for his radio. Sir, I need to report a case of severe frostbite. This Marine needs immediate evacuation. Sarah stepped forward. Corpsman, I'm refusing medical treatment. I want to continue to the finish line. The corpsman looked at her in disbelief. Marine, you could lose your fingers. This is serious frostbite. I understand the risks. I'm refusing treatment. The corpsman looked to Staff Sergeant Reynolds, who shrugged. It's her choice, Doc. At least let me document your condition, the corpsman said. He took photographs of Sarah's hands and had her sign a waiver, acknowledging that she was refusing medical treatment against medical advice. As they prepared to leave the medical checkpoint, David pulled Sarah aside. Sarah, I have to ask you one more time. Is this worth it? Sarah looked back up the mountain they had just descended, then forward toward the finish line that was still 4 miles away. She thought about her father, her brothers, and every conversation she had ever had about whether she was tough enough to be a Marine. David, if I quit now, I'll always wonder if I could have made it. But more than that, I'll have proven that Reynolds was right to take my gloves. I'll have proven that when things got really difficult, I gave up. David understood. Then let's finish this thing. The final 4 miles became a test of pure willpower. Sarah's hands were completely useless now, hanging at her sides like foreign objects attached to her arms. She had to rely on David and the other Marines to help her with any equipment adjustments, water, or food. But something remarkable was happening. Instead of feeling like a burden to the group, Sarah began to realize that her struggle was inspiring the other Marines to push through their own pain and exhaustion. When Private Johnson wanted to quit because of his ankle, he would look at Sarah continuing despite her hands. When Corporal Stevens felt like he couldn't breathe in the cold air, he would see Sarah breathing through her own pain. At mile 24, they encountered the steepest descent of the entire march. The trail switchbacked down a nearly vertical face, with ice making each turn treacherous. Sarah couldn't use her hands to steady herself, so David and Johnson positioned themselves on either side of her, creating a human safety net. "Just trust us," David said. "We've got you." Sarah had never felt so dependent on others in her life, but she had also never felt so supported. These Marines, who had started the march as her colleagues, had become something closer to family. As they descended the steep section, Staff Sergeant Reynolds appeared beside them. "Martinez, I want you to know something. What you're doing here today is the most impressive display of mental toughness I've seen in 20 years as a Marine." Sarah was surprised by the admission. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. But I also want you to know that if you had quit at any point, that would have been impressive too. Sometimes knowing when to stop is just as important as knowing when to continue." Sarah understood what he was saying. This wasn't just about proving she could endure pain. It was about making smart decisions under pressure. The fact that she had chosen to continue was her decision, but it wouldn't have been wrong to stop. With 2 miles remaining, Sarah began to allow herself to believe that she might actually complete the march. The trail had leveled out, and she could see the valley floor where the finish line was located. But she also knew that these final miles would be the most difficult, as exhaustion and pain accumulated. Her feet were beginning to show signs of frostbite as well. She could feel the burning sensation that indicated tissue damage, and her boots felt loose because her feet had lost sensation. But her feet were still functional, unlike her hands. Around her, the other Marines were also showing signs of extreme fatigue. The march had taken 21 hours so far, and everyone was running on willpower alone. But there was also a sense of excitement building as the finish line approached. At 1 mile remaining, a small crowd had gathered at the finish line. Word had spread about Sarah's situation, and Marines from other units had come to witness the completion of the march. Sarah could see vehicles, medical personnel, and what appeared to be senior officers waiting at the end of the trail. "Martinez," called Staff Sergeant Reynolds from behind her, "I want you to know that I've called ahead. There's a full medical team waiting for you at the finish line. The moment you cross, they're going to take care of your hands." Sarah nodded, grateful for the preparation. She knew she would need immediate medical attention, and she was no longer worried about appearing weak for accepting it. With half a mile remaining, Sarah's legs began to shake with exhaustion. She had been walking for over 21 hours, carrying a 60-pound pack in sub-freezing temperatures. Her body was at the absolute limit of its endurance, but around her, she could hear the voices of the Marines who had supported her throughout the march. David was beside her, encouraging her with every step. Johnson was behind her, telling her about the finish line celebration. Other Marines were sharing stories and jokes to keep her mind occupied. At 1/4 mile, Sarah could see the finish line clearly. It was a simple banner stretched across the trail, with timing officials and medical personnel waiting below. She could also see her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had come to witness the completion of the march. 200 meters, Sarah," David called out. "You've got this." Sarah's vision was beginning to blur from exhaustion, but she could see the banner ahead. Every step was now a conscious decision to continue, but she knew that nothing could stop her now. At 100 meters, the Marines behind her began to cheer. Other Marines at the finish line joined in, creating a noise that echoed off the mountains. Sarah realized that her completion of this march had become about more than her personal achievement. It had become a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to give up. With 50 meters remaining, Staff Sergeant Reynolds appeared beside her one final time. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. When I took your gloves, I thought I was teaching you a lesson about the realities of military service. Instead, you taught me a lesson about what real courage looks like." Sarah looked at him through her exhaustion. "Staff Sergeant, you gave me the opportunity to prove what I was capable of. I should thank you." At 20 meters, Sarah could see individual faces in the crowd. She saw medical personnel preparing to treat her hands, officers preparing to congratulate her, and fellow Marines showing respect for what she had accomplished. At 10 meters, Sarah's legs almost gave out, but David and Johnson caught her arms and helped her remain upright. "Together," David said, "we cross together." The three Marines walked the final 10 meters side by side, crossing the finish line as a unit. As soon as Sarah's feet crossed the banner, the medical team surrounded her, beginning immediate treatment for her frostbite. But before they could take her to the medical tent, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached her. "Marine, what you've accomplished here today will be remembered for a long time. You've shown everyone what the Marine Corps spirit looks like." Sarah tried to salute, but her hands wouldn't respond. Instead, she stood at attention as best she could. "Thank you, sir." As the medical team led her away, Sarah looked back at the trail she had just completed. 25 miles through mountainous terrain in sub-freezing temperatures, carrying a 60-pound pack with frostbitten hands. She had started the march as someone trying to prove she belonged in the Marines. She was finishing it as someone who had proven that belonging wasn't about size or strength. It was about refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a hospital room looking at her hands, which were wrapped in bandages. She had lost the tips of 2 fingers to frostbite, but the doctors had been able to save the rest. Her career in the Marines would continue, and her hands would function well enough for her to perform her duties. Staff Sergeant Reynolds knocked on the door and entered the room. He was carrying something wrapped in military-issue paper. "I brought you something." "Martinez?" He unwrapped the package to reveal a new pair of military-issue winter gloves, along with a set of liner gloves. "I figured you might need these for future training exercises." Sarah smiled. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds sat down in the chair beside her bed. "Martinez, I've been thinking a lot about that march, about what I did and why I did it." "Staff Sergeant, you don't need to explain anything." "Yes, I do. I took your gloves because I wanted you to fail. I wanted you to quit so I could prove that women didn't belong in the Marines. But what happened instead was that you proved that the strongest Marines aren't necessarily the biggest ones." Sarah looked at her bandaged hands. "I paid a price for proving that point." "Yes, you did. But you also gained something that can't be taken away. Every Marine who was on that march knows what you're capable of. That knowledge will follow you for the rest of your career." Reynolds stood to leave, then turned back. "One more thing, Martinez. My sister would have been proud of you." After he left, Sarah lay back in her hospital bed and thought about the march and what it had taught her. She had learned that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about continuing despite fear. She had learned that strength wasn't about physical capability. It was about mental determination. Most importantly, she had learned that earning respect wasn't about being perfect or never needing help. It was about being authentic in the face of challenges that revealed who you really were. 6 months later, Sarah was back on full duty, serving as an instructor for new recruits. Her story had become part of Marine Corps lore, told to new Marines as an example of what the Corps' values looked like in action. When new recruits asked her about the march, Sarah would show them her scarred fingers and tell them that the price of proving yourself was sometimes higher than expected. But she would also tell them that the cost of not trying to prove yourself was even higher. "The mountain didn't care that I was small," she would tell them. "The cold didn't care that I was a woman. But my fellow Marines cared enough to help me succeed when I proved I wouldn't quit. That's what this uniform represents. The commitment to never leave a fellow Marine behind, and the determination to never leave yourself behind either." Sarah Martinez had started the winter march trying to prove she belonged in the Marines. She had finished it proving that the Marines belonged to everyone willing to earn their place through courage, determination, and the refusal to accept defeat. The gloves that Staff Sergeant Reynolds had taken from her were just gloves. What she had found during those 25 miles in the mountains was something much more valuable: the knowledge that she could overcome any obstacle placed in her path, and the respect of fellow Marines who would follow her anywhere. The mountain had tested her, the cold had challenged her, and the march had changed her. But Sarah Martinez had emerged victorious, not because she had conquered the mountain, but because she had conquered the doubts, both her own and others, about what she was capable of achieving. Her father had been right when he told her that she would have to work twice as hard to prove herself. But what he hadn't told her, because he couldn't have known, was that when she finally proved herself, the victory would be twice as sweet.